The Mormon Church is hiding something massive, and it's finally leaking. The story you are about to hear isn't something you find in Sunday school manuals, missionary discussions, or cheerful church broadcasts. It's something that has been whispered about in corridors, buried in restricted archives, and sealed away in private vaults beneath the mountains of Utah for decades. And now, for the first time in modern history, pieces of something far bigger and far more unsettling have begun to leak. This isn't just about money, land, or doctrine. It's about a shadow quietly stretching across the American landscape, one that almost no one realized was growing, until now. For more than a century, the Mormon Church has presented itself as a spotless image of order, purity, unity, and divine purpose. Smiling missionaries walking 2 by 2, gleaming temples rising above cities, families dressed in perfect Sunday best, leaders speaking in careful, measured tones from behind polished pulpits. But behind the immaculate exterior, something else was forming, something enormous, something that very few people were ever meant to know. It began with silent acquisitions, land bought quietly under shell companies, investments masked under layers of legal insulation, records that never fully explained where massive flows of money were going. Former insiders say the movements were always described as for the Lord's purposes. But when they asked for details, the answers stopped. The doors closed. The lights went off. And the silence became unsettling, because what was happening didn't look like spiritual preparation. It looked like something else: consolidation, control. An empire made of paper and land, hidden behind a religious facade so carefully crafted that most members never even considered looking twice. If you worshipped, prayed, paid your tithing, attended your meetings, and stayed obedient, then everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. But if you stepped outside the lines, if you asked the wrong questions, if you noticed cracks forming in the structure, that's when the unease began. Former Mormons often describe a chilling moment when they realized something didn't align. Maybe it was a financial report that vanished overnight, or a missionary training manual that quietly changed, or a bishop who warned them not to investigate things the world wasn't ready for. The deeper some people looked, the more they noticed inconsistencies, missing pieces, and events that didn't match the official narrative. And then there were the vaults, massive, cold granite vaults built deep inside the mountains. Structures that, for decades, were rumored to hold records of every member who ever lived, genealogical files, rare documents, and sealed histories. But witnesses say that what the public sees is only a fraction of what lies deeper in the restricted zones, where access is limited to a handful of individuals whose names are never publicly disclosed. Why would a church need a facility engineered to withstand nuclear war? Why would a religious institution require blast-proof steel doors, biometric systems, and multi-layered checkpoints? Why would entire sections be sealed off with no explanation to the public? It was easy for church members to dismiss such questions as speculation, anti-Mormon lies, or misunderstandings spread online. And for a long time that worked, until the leaks started. Not physical leaks, informational ones. A former financial analyst from inside the church's investment arm said the numbers didn't quite make sense. Billions were moving, disappearing into preparation funds, long-term reserves, and unrealized projects. When he raised questions, he was relocated. When he asked again, he was told to focus on what builds faith. Others noticed how these funds were used, not for charity, not for member support, not for humanitarian aid, but for acquisition. Ranches the size of small states, water rights across multiple regions, entire city blocks, undeclared foreign holdings. And then, the document, the one leak that changed everything, the one that suggested the church wasn't just storing money, but preparing for something. In hushed circles of ex-members and insiders, people began connecting dots that had always been there. Hidden in plain sight, disguised as spiritual duty. Whispers of prophecies about future upheavals, talks about preparing Zion for a coming crisis, hints left in sealed portions of older revelations. Suddenly, every odd purchase, every hidden reserve, Every land acquisition, every vault, and every unusual leadership directive began to point to the same place. Something massive was being built, protected, shielded, and hidden. And for reasons the church never intended the world to uncover. For years, people online speculated that it was about money, or power, or secrecy. But the truth, at least the part that has leaked, is far more complex, and far more unnerving. Because according to the leak, the Mormon Church may have been preparing for something that affects not just its members, but the entire future of the United States. And the strangest part? Almost no one outside the highest levels of leadership even knew it was happening. What makes this entire situation more disturbing is how quietly everything unfolded. No announcements, no public statements, no financial disclosures that hinted at the true scale of what was happening. For decades, even the members who dedicated their entire lives to the church, people who tithed faithfully, served missions, cleaned chapels, and believed the leadership acted with complete transparency, had no idea that something enormous was forming beneath the surface. Most of them still don't. But to understand how this structure was built, and why the leak is so significant, you have to go back to the moment the church realized that money, not membership, would be its ultimate power. The shift happened generations ago, when leaders quietly concluded that spiritual influence alone couldn't protect the church from future threats. Political instability, economic collapse, social upheaval, or external scrutiny. They needed something stronger, something more permanent, something that could survive any crisis, land, assets, and a financial system that could operate almost invisibly. Former insiders say this wasn't a conspiracy. It was a strategy, a long-term one. And the public narrative of faith and family served as the perfect cover, while the real machinery worked in silence behind closed doors. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't openly corrupt. It was simply hidden, because exposure would raise questions the leadership never wanted to answer. That's where the vaults come in. Hidden deep within the Wasatch Mountains, behind massive blast-proof doors, lies a labyrinth of archives that few people have ever seen. Officially, it's a genealogical library, a place where the church preserves records for future generations. But former contractors, security personnel, and archivists tell a far more unsettling story. They describe restricted chambers with no labels, temperature-controlled corridors where no cameras are allowed, hallways that lead to locked zones that only a handful of individuals can enter. Some rooms contain microfilm that dates back centuries. Others hold documents stamped with security classifications that make no sense for a religious institution. And then there are the artifacts. Objects stored in sealed cases, origins never disclosed, their significance known only to a select few. Why would a church need this level of secrecy? Why would it invest in facilities designed to survive nuclear blasts, electromagnetic pulses, biological threats, and full-scale attacks? Why would it store documents so tightly guarded that even senior leadership doesn't have free access to them? The answer, according to the leak, is that the vault isn't just a collection of history, it's a fortress of information, a place designed to preserve knowledge that could shape, influence, or destabilize the church's position in the world. And some of that information, according to the anonymous source, contradicts narratives the church has taught for generations. But that's only one part of the leak. The second part is far more alarming. Over the past 30 years, the church has become one of the biggest landowners in the United States. Not just for religious purposes, but for something else entirely. Former financial employees say the acquisitions weren't random. They were strategic. Massive ranches in Florida and Nebraska, farmland across the Midwest, water rights in key regions of the West, entire blocks of commercial real estate in major cities, properties purchased under shell companies that, at first glance, have no connection to the church at all. Billions poured quietly into investments that have nothing to do with temples, humanitarian aid, or ecclesiastical operations. And all of it was hidden behind Ensign Peak Advisors. A financial operation so discreet that even high-level members didn't know it existed. What the leak revealed is that these purchases were part of a coordinated, decades-long plan, one designed to secure influence and stability for a future the church believes may be unstable, The source claims there were closed-door meetings discussing potential disruptions, economic collapse, shortages, infrastructure failures, political fragmentation. Not predictions, not prophecies, risk assessments. Quiet preparation for scenarios the church hoped would never come, but prepared for anyway. If true, this means the church wasn't simply saving money for the future. It was building a parallel system of power and resources, one that could operate even if traditional systems failed. And then there is the most unsettling claim, that the church leadership believes a massive shift is coming, and that these preparations are meant to secure the church's survival and influence during that change. The leak doesn't specify whether this shift is political, economic, or environmental. It only states that leaders referred to it as the period of refining, a phrase that appears nowhere in official doctrine, a phrase that seems to have been used only in top-level meetings, away from public ears. What's even more disturbing is the suggestion that the church has been gathering not just land and resources, but information. Data on members, families, conversions, resignations, internal concerns, disciplinary councils, and patterns of behavior. Stored, analyzed, possibly used to predict future loyalty or instability. Nobody knows the full extent. But the leak hints at a system far more advanced than anyone outside the church would expect from a religious organization founded in the 1800s. The more you look at the pieces, the vaults, the land, the money, the data, the more a pattern emerges. And it all leads to one chilling possibility, that the church is indeed just preparing for a crisis. It's preparing for a transformation. One that members never consented to, one that the world never saw coming, and one that may already be underway, hidden beneath layers of silence, paperwork, and faith. What gives this entire situation a deeper, more unnerving undertone is how deliberately everything was layered. Nothing about the church's strategy appears rushed or improvised. Every movement was calculated, measured, and placed like a piece in a long, slow game that most people didn't even realize they were part of. And according to the leak, the most important preparations weren't financial or agricultural, they were ideological. Beneath the public sermons about faith and family, something else was being shaped quietly. A cultural backbone strong enough to survive whatever the church believed was coming. Former employees who worked near leadership offices say they often heard phrases that didn't appear in scripture or conference talks. Phrases like fortify the base, maintain cohesion, stabilize the narrative, and ensure internal trust. These weren't spiritual instructions. They sounded more like directives from a geopolitical strategy room. And that alone raised unsettling questions, because why would a religious institution need to think in terms of narrative stability or internal cohesion unless it believed its influence could one day be challenged? That's when the leak reveals its most disturbing layer. It describes a series of private assessments, internal reports analyzing loyalty, obedience, and vulnerability among different groups within the church. The documents allegedly categorized members into subgroups based on age, activity level, financial contribution, likelihood to question doctrine, and even how easily they could be stabilized during times of social or political unrest. These reports weren't meant to judge people, they were meant to predict reactions. Reactions to what? That's the part no one outside the highest leadership seems to know. The source claims the leadership was particularly worried about something called the fracture point, a moment at which external pressure could cause internal division within the church. Whether that pressure would be political, economic, or doctrinal isn't stated. But the idea of a fracture point hints at something the church wanted to avoid at any cost, losing control of its own narrative. That fear explains why the vaults matter, why the land matters, why the funds matter, why the secrecy matters. Because if the church believes a fracture point could someday arrive, it needs an impenetrable structure prepared long before it happens. The leak points to one meeting in particular, a gathering of top leaders more than a decade ago, documented only in brief notes that were never meant to leave the room. The notes describe concerns about rapid cultural destabilization, increased secular scrutiny, and the vulnerability of emerging generations. Leadership allegedly discussed the possibility that younger members were becoming more independent, more skeptical, and less tied to traditional structures. And if that trend continued, the Church's future influence could weaken, not slowly but abruptly. That fear appears to have driven a new phase of preparation, one that focused not on land or wealth, but on control of information. At the time, the internet was becoming impossible to regulate, and thousands of members were beginning to access accounts of church history that contradicted official narratives. Former missionaries, former bishops, former Relief Society presidents, ex-temple workers, people with insider experience, began posting stories, documents, and testimonies online. And while many of them were dismissed as disgruntled or misinformed, the Church quietly recognized the threat. A decentralized wave of information could disrupt decades of controlled messaging. The leak suggests the Church responded in ways that were never publicly acknowledged. It established internal teams dedicated to monitoring online discussions, tracking emerging narratives, and controlling what information filtered through official channels. Algorithms were used to analyze trends, identify topics that caused spiritual instability, and predict which demographics were most at risk of losing faith. Ex-members who posted online claimed they were being watched, but most people didn't take them seriously. Now, the leak suggests they may not have been imagining it. But the most chilling part of the leak doesn't involve digital tracking or ideological assessments. It involves what the Church may have been preparing for physically. According to the documents, the Church wasn't just buying land, it was mapping it. Identifying which properties could sustain large groups of people, which regions had access to clean water, which ranches could support long-term food production, which zones were strategically placed away from urban centers in case of crisis. These weren't normal investments, they were contingency plans. Some former insiders have even described Zion clusters, areas where the Church could allegedly relocate members quickly during a large-scale disruption. Whether these were real plans or just theoretical assessments isn't confirmed, but the idea alone raises a terrifying question. What exactly does the Church believe might happen? The leak never gives a clear answer, but it does hint at something the leaders referred to simply as the shift, a change in the world that would redefine institutions, shake nations, and create instability across entire societies. Something big enough that the Church felt the need to create its own safety net, economic, ideological, and territorial. Something massive enough that the vaults, the land, the funds, the secrecy, and the preparations all point to the same unsettling truth. They weren't preparing for a symbolic event. They were preparing for a real one. And according to the source, the first signs of that shift may already be happening. The leak didn't describe the shift in detail. It didn't mention dates, predictions, or prophecies. It didn't claim to know whether the world would face political unrest, economic breakdown, environmental collapse, technological disruption, or something far less predictable. But what it did reveal was far more chilling than any prediction. That the Church wasn't waiting to find out. It was acting as if the shift had already begun. And once you see the pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. Quiet expansions of agricultural land in regions vulnerable to drought. Strategic purchases of water rights across the West, even when prices skyrocketed. Investments in farmland, located away from major fault lines or likely conflict zones. Subtle increases in self-reliance messaging, food storage, emergency preparation, home production, disguised as benign spiritual advice. A sudden rise in the Church's emphasis on obedience, unity, and avoiding outside influences. And most unsettling of all, a surge in the Church's efforts to centralize authority, reduce local autonomy, and tighten its grip on global membership through digital tools. These shifts weren't random. They followed a pattern so precise that it almost felt rehearsed, as though the entire church structure, down to its smallest congregations, was quietly being reshaped for endurance rather than expansion, resilience rather than missionary work, survival rather than growth. You can ignore whispers from disgruntled ex-members. You can dismiss internet speculation, but you cannot dismiss what the church itself has done with its money, its land, its secrecy, and its silence. And this brings us to the leak's final and most disturbing claim. According to the anonymous source, There is a restricted report inside the vault, one that only a handful of individuals have ever seen. The report allegedly outlines operational strategies in the event of a nationwide systems failure, financial, infrastructural, or governmental. The Church doesn't frame this as prophecy. It frames it as probability. The document allegedly includes relocation pathways, emergency communication networks, supply chain maps for church-owned land, and protocols for maintaining control and unity among millions of members during a crisis. This isn't speculation, it's preparation. A level of preparation no religious organization should logically need, unless it knows, or strongly believes, that something massive is coming. Something that could fracture the world far more suddenly than anyone expects. Something that could transform nations, economies, and institutions. Something the Church has quietly anticipated for decades while maintaining a public image of calm spiritual leadership. And here says what makes everything even more unsettling. The leak suggests that the Church's leadership doesn't believe the shift is far away. They believe it's unfolding right now. Not in a single catastrophic event, but in subtle tremors. Cracks in global systems, instability in governments, loss of trust in institutions, economic unpredictability, wars of information, and cultural fragmentation. Slow enough that most people don't notice. Fast enough that the Church began accelerating its preparations behind the scenes. If that's true, then everything the Church has done, the vaults, the land, the funds, the secrecy, the ideological consolidation, points to one unspoken conclusion. The Church isn't hiding something small or insignificant. It's hiding the scope of what it believes is coming, and the world is only now starting to see pieces of it leak through the cracks. For years, people mocked the idea that the Church was preparing for something massive. They joked about the vault, about the food storage, about the Church's quiet financial empire. But now, with billions in hidden reserves exposed, with land acquisitions traced back to shell companies, with whistleblowers emerging from inside its most secretive departments, the laughter has faded. Something is happening. Something the public wasn't supposed to know yet. Something that the leak only begins to reveal. But here's the most haunting part. Those who understand the Church's history, prophecies, and internal culture know that leaders almost never act without a reason. If the Church is preparing on this scale, what does it know? What has it seen? What is buried deep inside the restricted vaults, locked away behind granite, steel, and silence? No one outside the inner circle may ever know the full truth. But one thing is certain. If these leaks are just the beginning, then the question isn't whether the Church is hiding something, it's what else hasn't leaked yet. And if the first pieces coming to the surface are already this massive, then the rest must be far bigger than anyone imagined. So now the only question left is this. If the Mormon Church has been preparing for decades for a world-shifting event, what exactly do they believe is coming, and how much longer until the next leak reveals the rest?